Welcome to this webinar about the conclusions of the Community Heat Development Unit project. Just to flag, this webinar is being recorded. Please direct questions for later on in the session to the Q&A function within Zoom. There'll be ability to upvote and rank questions and submit new ones through that. And the chat should be enabled as well. So please feel free to introduce yourself and say hello. In terms of introductions, hi there, I'm John Taylor from Community Energy England. And we've also got Ben and Dave from Sharenergy on the call as well. Community Energy England, we're the membership body for the community energy sector, represent about 340 plus social enterprises and local organisations, people clubbing together to build out renewable energy for the benefit of their local community. It's not just solar panels and wind power and hydropower, it's also the whole energy spectrum. So heat is a very big focus of what we do, and certainly is going to be the big next phase of decarbonising the UK's energy system. The Community Heat Development Unit is a project funded by the Energy Redress Fund, led by Sharenergy, with support from ourselves at Community Energy England, as well as LuxNova Partners, Carbon Alternatives, and the Marches Energy Agency. I'll hand over to Dave and Ben to say hello and carry on with the rest of the event.
Thanks, John. I'll just introduce myself. So, my name is Ben Cannell. I work at Sharenergy. My role on the project has been community heat development consultant. I've been doing most of the work on the project. Dave's going to give an intro first before we get into the details of what we've done.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Dave Green. I'm Development Manager at Sharenergy. Go to the next slide, Ben. So I don't know if you've heard of Sharenergy, but we were set up in 2011. We work purely on community energy projects across England, Scotland, and Wales. We're a not-for-profit cooperative. Any surpluses we create, we plough back into incubating new ideas, basically. And our biggest incubation recently has been the big solar co-op. But we also have been hosting the Community Heat Development Unit. Okay. I'm going to speak very briefly to these slides because we've got a lot of slides to get through, and it's the meat of what Ben's got to say that we need to get on with. But heat is a really important part of decarbonising our economy, and it's the one that there are the biggest questions about. We know how to decarbonise electricity, but decarbonising heat is really tricky. Okay. So DESNZ have an aim. The government has an aim of increasing the amount of buildings on heat networks to 20% by 2050, whereas currently it's under 2%. So there's an awful lot of work to be done to get us there. They have brought in a whole heat network regulation and heat network zoning, but that's seems to be very much focused on non-domestic, and we're really interested in how we can do heat networks for covering mostly domestic properties. Okay. And we're basically looking at centralized heat networks. In Denmark, 70% of homes are on such a network. It's not a wacky idea out of the cloud. It's quite common elsewhere. We haven't been looking at a decentralized heat networks, the sort of thing that Net Zero Terrace Streets have been working on. Partly because I think we put our bet on centralized networks, but also we didn't want to repeat what other work was carried on elsewhere. Okay, and I think I'll hand over to Ben from here.
So for those who aren't aware, I guess maybe skip back to this one. There's two forms of centralized heat networks. There's district heat networks, which might be village, town, city-wide, which is on the left, where you've got hot water pipes in the ground and you've got heat produced at some central plant. Typically, that's been gas CHP. But but more networks are moving to expand or to change their heat source to be heat pump focused. And the other kind of centralized heat network is a communal heat network, which is the image on the right. So you've got some central plant in a block of flats, which might just be a boiler in the basement, and then heat is exchanged into each flat via a heat interface unit. So then yeah, in both models, as a consumer, you buy your heat like you'd be buying your gas or electricity. So it's metered on the way into your property. Um, so yeah, in your home, here's a example of what kind of a installation looks like. It's not necessarily the prettiest one, but the heat interface unit would essentially replace an existing gas boiler or oil boiler in your home. It's perhaps a bit smaller. You'd have hot water pipes coming from the street outside into your property. The heat interface unit would be the interface between those pipes from the network main into your to transfer heat into your home wet heating system. So already where if you've got radiators installed already, then they would be transferring heat into the fluid in your radiators. So in terms of disruption on the home, there's quite relatively minimal disruption. Centralized heat networks are designed to operate at similar flow temperatures to what your existing gas or oil boiler would be running at. So I guess that's partly in it's an argument, I suppose, in favour of decarbonising buildings with heat networks. There's less requirement for more intrusive retrofit that can then come later to reduce people's bills. So yeah, in terms of what's been done so far, so from a community-led heat network perspective, there's mostly some small biomass heat networks around. I guess Swaffham Prior is the main example of a community-led heat network, but it's not community-owned. It's owned by Cambridgeshire County Council. This is an example of an image, sorry, of the energy centre there. So they've got a mix of ground source heat pump and air source heat pump to yeah, to provide the heat. But the location's very rural. It's not necessarily financially replicable in other locations. So in terms of other examples, been quite a large number of case studies have been done, again, led by communities, but yeah, very few of them have got further than the first stage of feasibility. And generally it's because they've been in locations which just are poorly suited to heat networks, so rural villages without much heat demand. For a heat network, you want to be putting in as little pipe in the ground for as much heat which you can sell, essentially. So just the density has not been enough. And yeah, well, mostly Dave from Sharenergy and colleagues in Shropshire and Telford Community Energy and Lightfoot have been working on looking into a heat network project at Bishop's Castle. So I guess that was part of the inspiration for the CHDU project. So the objectives of the CHDU to try and take a slightly a different approach. So it's a research project. We wanted to uh, take the approach of saying which locations would be a better place, better suited for trying to develop community-owned heat networks, centralized heat networks, and then how do we go about identifying those locations and working with local organizations at a handful of those to develop some case studies. And alongside that, we wanted to be thinking about what kind of support unit may or may not be needed to be set up to support communities to go to develop the heat networks from initial feasibility stage into operation and ongoing management, etc. So yeah. So first thing we did was we reviewed existing projects. I guess the original aim was to try and find a kind of examples of projects which have been successful in terms of centralized low carbon heat networks, and just say, okay, let's choose that model and take that one forward and try and replicate that elsewhere. So we spent quite a bit of time, yeah, at the start of the project looking at different information sources like heat network planning database. Sorry, I was moving the bar away from my screen. Yeah, research papers, projects which have been funded already through different funding streams and also community-led work. And on our website there, this week we've just been publishing like the main outputs from the project in terms of reporting, and yeah, there's a link to Appendix 1, which is the literature review work which we did. So that's freely available. So yeah, some of so we didn't establish, there wasn't a clear route forward for taking an existing project and trying to replicate that. Partly because there's not very many low carbon heat networks in the UK. It's quite early days. And abroad, they tend to be extensions to existing gas CHP projects. So they're not necessarily, it's not the same starting point of trying to retrofit a heat network to existing buildings and decarbonize their heating. Um, so some of the key findings, I suppose, were projects in the UK, in terms of low carbon heat networks, the average grant fundings they've had 50% of the capex paid for. Most of the remaining funding has come from local authorities so far. In terms of technology choices, it seems like air source heat pumps are by far the main technology which has been investigated, if not selected, to be moved forward with for providing much of the heat into the network. Um, other heat sources seemed appealing, like river source heat pumps, for example, or mine water source heat pumps. But from our perspective, mine water, for example, from our perspective, seemed too risky for communities to take on. Um, there's quite a reasonable number of examples of mine water heat network projects having operational issues due to the water chemistry, and I think there's generally quite a bit of uncertainty as to what you're going to find when you start drilling those initial boreholes to test what's going on under the ground. Likewise for river source heat pumps, it seems like the constraints on being able to access the heat in the rivers and being awarded extraction and discharge licenses for taking water out and putting it back in at a lower temperature. Um, Again, seemed too risky for kind of a replicable model, which is what we were looking for. Yeah, another point it's important to note is that most of the community-led feasibility studies noted that renewable, including some form of local renewable generation to provide the power to heat pumps within a heat network, was predicted to improve financial viability. So that was kind of a plus for that as an option. So yeah, so the approach we've taken is let's try and identify and establish a replicable model, and then we'll try and identify sites around the country where that model can be replicated, and then work with communities at their locations to establish some case studies. So the model which we've taken forward uses large air source heat pumps to provide much of the heat. Um, lower coefficient of performance, lower efficiency than ground source heat pumps, but significantly less capex and significantly less site-to-site variability. There's a greater chance you're going to be able to install a large air source heat pump compared to a large ground source heat pump when you don't know which locations you're looking at to start off with. Um, yeah, we aiming not aiming for 100% decarbonisation of heating, because there's the cost barrier is significantly harder if you're aiming for 100% versus 80 to 90%. So taking the approach of saying we're going to provide 80 to 90% of the heat with the electrified heat source with the air source heat pumps, with 10 to 20% of the heat provided by backup hydrocarbon boilers, so gas or oil boilers. And in the future, those could be replaced by electric boilers if the price of electricity compared to oil or gas reduced enough. And also, as Dave mentioned, we want to focus on um, being able to heat domestic buildings whilst also incorporating some non-domestic anchor loads. Yeah, I guess it's part of the research show and our understanding of heat network viability has made it clear you need to have a combination of some reasonable non-domestic heat demands combined with domestic buildings. The non-domestic essentially helps make the domestic a bit more affordable. Yeah, and as I said, the community-led feasibility studies generally indicated that including onshore renewables was going to be beneficial to the overall finances. If you can produce a lot of your electricity locally, then there's some cost benefit to that. There's also potential an extra income stream by either selling electricity via direct wire, electricity that isn't used in the heat pumps via direct wire to a local off-taker, and or exporting any excess electricity to the grid. So yeah, there's a graph there which shows the correlation between the monthly correlation between heat demand, wind generation, and solar demand at one of our case study sites. So yeah, the blue and the red bars, they kind of follow the same trend. They're higher in the winter seasons than they are in the summer season, versus solar, which has the opposite trend. So we've mostly focused on identifying locations which have the potential for developing local onshore wind. Yeah, and I guess another benefit of a centralized district heat network is that you can store energy quite cheaply in the form of very large hot water tanks. So again, in our model, we've assumed that or incorporated large hot water tanks into that. That couples well with wind as well, because you can basically use the heat pumps to generate heat when there's available wind energy and fill up your hot water tank for use later in the day or the next day. So there's a good synergy between those technologies. So what is the offer to customers if they're on a heat network? Yeah, I think thing to start off saying is it's very difficult to be able to reduce people's heating bills with moving to an electrified heat source, mostly because of the difference between the price of gas and electricity at the moment. It's 3 to 4 times the price. So yeah, you need to be operating your heat pumps at 3.5, 4 times the efficiency of your gas boiler, just to be breaking even with your costs, let alone paying back the initial capital expenditure. So the main offers of being on a low carbon heat network are particularly with local renewable generation. So particularly because it's quite energy self-sufficient, is that you help insulate customers from future gas price shocks, such as what we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine. It's an option for domestic properties to avoid intrusive retrofit. So it's potentially quicker and more straightforward for buildings to join a heat network rather than install individual heat pumps, depending on what the building fabric's like itself. And then yeah, building fabric upgrades can be implemented in the future to reduce people's overall energy demand. The aim would be to enable domestic properties to reduce their emissions with no upfront cost to the individuals, and also to enable domestic properties to heat their homes without increasing their costs. So we're saying we're aiming for domestic properties to be able to connect to the network without having to pay anything up front, and then there'd be no additional cost in terms of their operating costs. So there'd be a standing charge for being on the network, which is equivalent to the annualized cost of replacing your oil boiler and servicing it, and then a heat unit charge, which is equivalent to the price of heat from a gas boiler. Yeah, we're specifically looking at community-owned heat networks, so ensuring this is key infrastructure. So we wanted to try and ensure that networks which we support are developed as non-for-profits, and community ownership obviously ensures social representation in the decisions around how that network's being operated, etc. And then there's also reliability benefits, that the scheme's taking on the operation and maintenance, and ensuring quality of service. Yeah, that's taken on by the community-owned scheme. So to go from our, I guess, heat network concept to identifying locations, we first did some techno-economic modeling, so trying to bring together the engineering and the financial aspects. There's a model on our website, an interactive model on our website, which may or may not be useful. It'd be good, yeah, if you end up using it, then it'd be good to hear from you. Let us know how useful it is, if there's anything we can do to make it more useful. But yeah, it takes some generalized inputs, such as heat demand from domestic and non-domestic buildings, number of buildings connected, amount of renewable generation, size of site, mean air temperature, and some financial inputs. Um, and then yeah, from that it then calculates the financial performance of the proposed network. Um, so what's included, we've got hourly demand profiles for different building types, renewable generation profiles, air temperature, COP profiles, yeah, and various different cost estimates. And again, on our website, we've got the details of how we've put the models together, and yeah, along with the model itself. I guess there's a couple of examples of some of the work we did to develop this, because the purpose of it is a screening model to try and identify potential sites across the UK. So we're not going and defining specific network layouts across the UK. We've tried to I guess estimate like a network length for a density of building in a particular area. But yeah, there wasn't information about how to do this um, available as far as we were aware. So we did some work using some simulations from Thermos with help from Martin at Carbon Alternatives. So Thermos is a bit of software which allows you to do some heat network layout modeling. I'll show you some examples later. And then yeah, produce some trends from that essentially, which relates building density to network length. So we could take some mapping output, which estimates what the building density is across the UK, and from that estimate some network lengths. Yeah, another example is we generated some of network scale, heat network scale demand profiles for domestic and non-domestic buildings. For domestic, we used the output from a Strathclyde research project, which used real gas consumption data in different kind of building types with different occupancy levels to generate some profiles. So that's what we've built into the model. And then we used a piece of software called MPro to help generate some profiles for different kind of non-domestic building types, such as leisure centres and schools and offices, etc. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The graph on the right is an example of 10% of the heat coming from a gas boiler and green, and 90% of the heat coming from the heat pump. So green is the amount of heat from the heat pump, the area covered by the green chart, and the pink is 10% of the annual heat provided by the gas boiler. So how to go from the model to identifying potential locations. First, we did some renewables constraints mapping. So we did, yeah, the focus is mostly on wind. So we did some wind constraints mapping. I basically identifying parcels of land where there's the potential to install wind generation. So we filtered land based on different land usage types. Had access to OS address-based data to kind of cut out locations which are close to houses and other kinds of buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And then, yeah, we use capacity factors from Global Wind Atlas, which we limited up to 30%. And then, yeah, we tried to identify how many turbines of 1 megawatt size could be located on them on those parcels of land to get a bit of an estimate of what the potential annual yield is from each area. So that meant we had different parcels of land which had a number attached to them, which was roughly what you might expect to be able to generate if you had wind turbines installed there. And then we did the same with solar, limited the size of the arrays up to about 3 megawatts, which is about the size which we would expect a community might be installing for this purposes. But yeah, in the end, because wind was it's a much better match than solar, generally is better off focusing on wind generation if you're looking at a heat project from yeah, from our research. So then yeah, in terms of looking at other screening data which we use to feed into that model, we put together, well, we've put together estimates of heat demand using domestic estimates from a data set which is from a project called Hot Maps, which estimates, yeah, we mostly use it to estimate the domestic heat demand at different buildings. So their methodology looked at building locations and occupancy levels and building ages. and like lat long positions to estimate what the annual heat demand is. It seemed the best source of data which was available, given we didn't have access to, I guess, nationwide extrapolations of EPC data, for example. Um, and then we used DEC data, so display energy certificate data, for public buildings to kind of spot locations of higher heat demand from some non-domestic buildings. Hot maps also includes estimates of non-domestic building heat demand, but generally it's based on roof area rather than actual energy usage in that building, so it's not necessarily that useful. And then for the screening, we reduced the domestic demand down by 50% to represent 50% domestic uptake. So we weren't being overly optimistic in a location. Yeah, as I mentioned, we had access to address-based data. So we produced similar density maps, but for numbers of buildings in an area. Um, and then we went through a process of filtering the heat demand, filtering out all the small areas of heat demand, to essentially try and reduce the number of sites which we had to analyze, um, and then went through a process of parceling up the remaining areas where there's enough heat demand into sites of different sizes, um, sampling the rest of the data set, so sampling the heat demand, sampling the building demand, the building density in these data sets, associating them with nearby renewable sites, and then running them through the model. And yeah, as I said before, we're targeting the gas price. There was a question at the start of the project whether we should be focusing on off-gas grid locations, but I guess two factors: the price of heating oil is pretty low at the moment, so there's not really that much of a benefit of from a in terms of the price which you could sell heat at. There's not really any benefit looking at a oil location, and also we did a screening of off-gas grid locations, and generally they're more rural. They have less anchor loads. There's very few which had any reasonable anchor loads. So Bishop's Castle site in Shropshire, which we've looked at, is quite unusual in that it has a leisure centre with a swimming pool there, at an off-gas grid location. So in terms of being able to have a broad enough scope for identifying potential sites, we focused on gas locations. And then yeah, then we ran these sites for our model, and essentially rank them based on the estimated payback period from our model. So uh, yeah, brings up lots of potential sites. Yeah, I guess conclusion is very, very dependent on local wind generation. So if there's not good local wind generation nearby, then places were discounted. And yeah, this map is available on our website. So yeah, please visit it if it's of interest. Yeah, we tried to simplify what's presented on the website as much as possible. So yeah, generally we hope it's useful for people trying to, I guess, focus in on areas which might be kind of preferable target areas if you're interested in looking into heat network development in your location. And we've also included the annual demand and building density maps as well. So yeah. So once we've got a ranked list of sites, essentially, then working with Community Energy England and also Iona Hodge at the Local Energy Scotland, as she went on the Community Heat Development Programme, we went about correlating locations of community energy organisations or community groups who CEE and CARES are in touch with, to try and get in contact with people who might be interested in working with us on some location specific case studies to look into the model in more specific detail, at specific sites. So yeah, the black and white dots are basically all Community Energy England, either projects or organisation contacts. So yeah, so through them we then identified 3 locations where there was a interested organisation and a better site. So the case studies which we've looked at, um, uh, where we've investigated centralised district heat networks, is Forres up in the top of Scotland, some near Inverness, um, Morecambe, so the West End Sandilands area of Morecambe, and then Jackman's estate in Letchworth. And we've also looked into a different style of model at Bishop's Castle, but I'll come on to that later. We're going to focus on the centralized heat networks for the time being. So, yes, I guess the commonality between the three case study sites, the three centralized district heat network case study sites, are that in general, the domestic buildings located there are less suited to individual air source heat pumps. So I'll give you some more specific examples in a minute, but lots of them lacking outdoor space and harder to insulate properties, older Victorian properties. Um, in Letchworth, particularly, I guess there's affordability issues. So there's a high proportion of social housing or lower incomes there. So I guess there's what you may technically air source heat pump individual heat pumps may be best in those locations, then there is that issue of affordability. And I guess with the centralized heat network, we're aiming at being able to connect customers at no upfront cost and not increase their electricity, not increase their annual heat energy bills. The sites also have multiple reasonable wind prospects. So let's say if there was a site with one wind site, we were trying to avoid those, just so there's not putting all eggs in one basket. And the sites also had some like reasonable public anchor loads. So they all had leisure centres with pools, libraries, town halls, schools. Some blocks of flats, some existing community heated buildings as well. So I'm just going to run through the case study sites one by one. So in Forres, we initially had contact with someone from Reheat. He had through Iona, Local Energy Scotland, where they were looking at a biomass-based heat network initially, and then we ended up working mostly with Community Energy Murray to engage with local residents and organisations up there. Yes, the network that we've been looking at is focused on Forest High Street, so that's what the photos are of here. As you can see, older buildings. There's not much space around the back, no space out the front for individual air source heat pumps, and generally more limited options for insulating. So quite well suited to centralized district heat network. It's also densely packed. This is the output from our screening model. We're focusing on what initially brought the location to our attention, I guess, is the dark purple side, and then leading up to where it says Forest in the orange patch. So there's a swimming pool and a large school currently, which are currently co-located. But as we began conversations with Murray Council, became aware that they were moving the school, and then the leisure centre was then therefore too far away from the high street where a lot of the rest of the heat demand is. So we've ended up focusing on a network which is which spreads along the high street of Forres. The yellow and blue parcels of land are potential wind sites, and the primary substation which needs a connection to for the heat pump and the wind turbine is located just north of the A96, so it's quite close to where the centre of town is. So from our modelling, we've estimated that a network located along the high street could serve about 200 buildings, and amongst those that includes over 300 different dwellings or businesses. A lot of the buildings along the high streets have got a shop front downstairs, and then flats or a maisonette above. We estimated there's over 7 GWh of heat per year, and overall that's a 90% reduction in the CO2 emissions. That would be achieved by moving those properties onto a centralized district heat network with wind and air source heat pumps. There's also quite a good energy centre location. There's an old Tesco site, which is identified on that map, which has been empty for about 20 years or so, I think. And a local solar um, and solar thermal manufacturer and installer has recently purchased that, and so we've had some initial discussions about the possibility of an energy centre being located there, but it's quite close to the network main. So yeah, from a financial perspective, that's quite it's very useful. So the next case study site we looked at is Morecambe, in the northwest of England. Yes, at Morecambe, we worked with Anne at Morecambe Bay Community Renewables. So yeah, she did a lot of work helping us trying to engage with local residents and organisations. And the focus in that area is on the West End Sandilands area. So yeah, West End area is mostly 3, 4, 5 story Victorian terraces. Um, Again, very limited space outside for individual air source heat pumps. And yeah, in general, I guess the income level and for affordability, the income level of the population is quite low. So affordability for doing individual installations is fairly limited. Um, yeah, again, this is the output from our mapping work. There's a few wind sites towards the southwest of the focus area. We're proposing a 4.2 megawatt wind turbine, so similar to the Ambition Lawrence Western turbine. And there's actually a number of wind turbines already around this area, close to where Heysham Moss is flagged on the map. So the initial proposed network would include 450 buildings, 650 homes, it's about 11 gigawatt hours of heat a year. Yeah, again, mostly Victorian terraces. There's the main anchor loads are the school and the swimming pool, which is down at the bottom right, which also has got potentially got space for the energy centre to be located. Um, I think for this location, we're estimating that for to ensure financial viability, 20% of the heat would come from gas boilers. So um, yeah, so then that essentially results in an 80% reduction in the emissions compared to the people's existing heating systems. We also did a bit of extra work to try and understand the potential for the network expansion and if the O&M cost could be reduced by 10% or that kind of equivalent cost could be found in reductions in the initial capital costs, then the network could expand significantly up to about 810 buildings, which is a large proportion of the properties in the West End area. Um, So third location is Letchworth. Say Ribble Ival Community Energy is our kind of local contact, local community energy organisation there. We've focused on the Jackman's estates. So yes, this is a slightly different kind of area with different archetypes of buildings to the last two. So less Victorian terraces and more modern social housing, and it's more of a modern housing estate essentially. Um, so yeah, it was of interest because there's a large portion of blocks of flats. There's lots of properties there. There's also the properties are, well, they're quite dispersed. They're dispersed with green space as potential to be able to install the pipe work in the verge of the road. There's a lot of verge space along the side of the road. So that's less disruption for people living in the area. It's also it should be cheaper because you don't need to be trenching in the highway itself. And reinstatement costs would be cheaper, for example. Um, so yeah, again, here's the mapping output. Quite a few different potential wind sites towards the east and the southeast of the estate. Part of the initial appeal was to be able to also connect North Hart's Leisure Centre, which is a very large leisure centre. I think the EPC, the DEC certificate indicated that it was 3 to 4 GWh of heat a year. It's such a large leisure centre, so it would be a great anchor load. Unfortunately, once we'd spoken to North Harts County Council, they confirmed that they'd had PSDS funding to install individual air source heat pumps. Yes, there's still potential um, for the council, well, for the leisure centre to purchase behind the meter electricity from the wind turbines. So there's the potential for that income stream to still be viable. But that's quite a big loss for the overall heat demand of the network. Um, so here we're proposing 3 MW wind turbine, connected to the heat network. As I said before, it's high proportion of social housing, one social housing landlord mostly. Um, Potential to reduce the complexity of a number of stakeholders to engage with to be able to develop a network here. Um, the initial network layout that we're proposing covers 830 buildings and homes. There's about 9 GW of heat per year across the network. It's mostly a mix of flats and terraces. Some of the blocks of flats are already communally heated, but mostly not. And then the anchor loads are much poorer than at the other locations or much less useful, so I should say, than the other locations with the loss of the leisure centre from the network. Um, I guess because a lot of the properties are social housing, there's potential to access warm home scheme funding. At the moment, you can't use the fund to fund heat network connections, but the wording, to my knowledge, but the wording is such that it indicates that's the direction it's moving in. I think it's essentially waiting on some of the heat network technical assurance standards to be completed for to then feed into the warm home scheme. So that would potentially enable 7.5 grand per property, I think from memory, to be used to fund the heat network connections. I've also point here is retrofitting to flats isn't we don't think it's as financially viable as first hoped. The cost estimates which we've got for retrofitting a heat network to houses is if you exclude the pipe work in the ground, so just from the entry into the house going and then replacing the gas boiler with the heat interface unit is um, around 9 grand for a house, and then if for a low-rise blocks of flats, then that goes somewhere between 7.5 and 8.5 grand. So there's not a huge cost saving there connecting blocks of flats compared to connecting a house. So that's 7.5 to 8.5 grand per flat. We'd hope that there'd be slightly more benefit connecting to a block of flats, but the individual connections aren't that cheap, but the amount of pipe work you need in the ground is less. Um, this table is in our final report, just a couple of points. Yes, Forres is looking like the most viable. So the heat density, the linear heat density is the best. So the amount of heat which is delivered per length of pipe. It's quite a compact network, and I guess with the buildings being so much further north compared to the other sites, or particularly compared to Letchworth, then uh, the heat demand is higher. It's colder throughout most of the year. Um, the of the three sites, we think Forres has the most potential. Um, it's partly because of that additional heat demand and higher heat density, but also because the grant funding scheme in Scotland is slightly different to the Green Heat Network Fund in England. The grant funding scheme in Scotland will provide 50% of the capital costs of the network, whereas in England, there's a limit on the amount of grant funding which is available, which essentially reduces reduces the available grant fund. So we expect it's more like 30% of the capital costs of the network capital costs, which could be funded in England. Um, yeah, the project's IRRs and overall payback periods for Morecambe and Forres were quite similar, but we've assumed a reduction in the connection costs for Morecambe by about 2 grand. So I guess there's a hope that some of the connection costs would be able to be funded by some of the private landlords who are located in the area, and also perhaps through some of the public sector flavour decarbonisation schemes, such as the Warm Homes Fund. But for Letchworth, the heat density essentially isn't high enough, particularly without that leisure centre, for a scheme to be viable under the current funding arrangements. Um, uh, Important to note that the amount of CO2 saved on each of the schemes is significantly less than kind of the minimum requirement for the Green Heat Network Fund. So in Forres, we estimate the grams of CO2 per kilowatt heat delivered to be 18, which is about 20% of the Green Heat Network Fund limit, and then Morecambe 30% of the Green Heat Network Fund limit, and Letchworth 40%. So significantly greater savings than what is required to be able to access the grant funding in England. So that's the end of commentary on the technical aspects of the centralized heat network. There's case study reports for each of those three locations available on our website. So please read those if you're interested. So yeah, at each of the sites we had the local community energy organisations helped us to organise and deliver local workshops. The aim was to try and engage with local organisations who are interested in the area and particularly residents. So we to try and share information about what we were investigating in their area and gauge their interest in connecting to a network, and also try and understand if there were kind of local advocates in the area who would be able to support us going forward, and be keen to take the project forward, I guess, at a local level. So in terms of marketing of the events, we did that through presentations to local groups, publications in local papers, online, and then in-person flyering. So I think Anne at Morecambe delivered 450 flyers to households in the area. But despite that, there was still a very poor turnout. So I guess one of our learnings perhaps is that maybe a different approach would be to try and, I guess, take the project to existing events where there's existing footfall already. So Forres had the best turnout with 10 attendees, including the local MP, Graham Ledbetter, who's in that photo there, and that's Charlotte from Murray Community Energy. So I guess ultimately it's quite disappointing, the level of engagement which we had at the local workshops, and hard to, other than at Forres, where there have been keen local advocates since our initial meeting, and we're having some ongoing discussions with them. But the other locations, it was not good local support at this stage. So challenges that we've faced to developing, I guess, establishing whether these networks could be developed and would be worth being developed moving forward. So yes, PSDS funding, removing some of the good anchor loads. So there's as I mentioned, North Herts Leisure Centre had its own. They decided that they managed to get funding to install their own individual heat pumps, and had the similar experience at Bishop's Castle, where we've looked into a centralised heat network as part of a different package of work. But the leisure centre at Bishop's Castle is also pursuing installing their own individual heat pumps. So they're neither of those good anchor loads, and no longer as useful to the network as they were previously. yeah, stagnation of oil and gas prices, and I guess stagnation of the spark gap, the difference between the price of electricity and the price of gas, um, yeah, have limited. I guess that essentially limits the sale price of heat and therefore the income available into the scheme. Um, which, yeah, coupled against finance costs isn't a good relationship. So then the costs for installing the pipework and the trenching are they've been it's difficult to get a clear view on the costs until you've got a project with a network layout with a specific network layout. But yeah, we've had quotes ranging between like 50% of each other. So it's quite a significant range. Um, yeah, we think there's quite a bit of work to be done to try and understand if you can reduce the cost of connecting to retrofitting a heat network to individual domestic buildings. Um, don't think there's options which could be available to be smarter about how buildings are connected. For example, if you've got a four-story terrace and all the gas flues are coming through a perforation in the wall into the outside, could you run a pipe up the outside of the wall, like a network main up the outside of the wall, and pass the heat network pipework through those existing holes? Therefore, you're not drilling additional holes, you're not navigating the interior of the building in the same way. Um, so yeah, that doesn't we as far as we're aware, it doesn't seem like people are trying to tackle the specifics of these things. Um, and then, yeah, what I haven't mentioned before is that the Green Heat Network Fund in England is advertised to be able to offer grant support at a rate of 4.5 pence per kilowatt of heat delivered in the first 15 years, which um, essentially means that the overall the amount of grant funding which is available goes from, say, about 50% of the heat network costs to about 30% of the heat network costs. So if it goes from 4.5p to 2.5p. So the graph which we've got here shows the amount of grant funding available from the Green Heat Network Fund. It's a competitive scheme, so the lower the amount of grant you ask for, the more likely you are to receive the grant. And over the various different rounds, you can see that the rate has dropped. And I think our understanding is that the schemes which are competitive, um, are perhaps able to access multiple funding pots. So, but yeah, be good to have some feedback on this. So let's say if you're a scheme which are connecting lots of public sector buildings, then up until recently when the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund got canned, you could access Green Heat Network funding to fund your network installation. But for the connection costs, you could then access PSDS funding to fund those connections. And so you could essentially subsidize the network costs through two different grant routes. And that's not available to domestic properties. You can't use the boiler upgrade scheme, for example, to fund connection to a heat network. So yeah, from the locations which we've looked at, the level of grant funding which the scheme needs to become borderline financially viable would be 4.5 pence, which is not what the competitive rate is that people are requesting or have requested so far from the Green Heat Network Fund. Yeah, but perhaps the warm home scheme, changes to the warm home scheme, may be able to counteract this at some of the locations which we've looked at. Yeah, more funding potentially available in Scotland because they don't. Our understanding is that they don't have the same limit. It's a capex percentage limit, which is capped at 50%. So yeah, at the start of the presentation, John mentioned LuxNova have supported us on this. So we've got, yeah, one of the aspects of our project was to consider some of the legal aspects of developing a heat network and for different ownership models. So LuxNova have done some advisory work for us to produce a report, which is on our website as Appendix 7, to look into legal considerations for a heat entrepreneurship ownership model. That would be where the community organization owns the heat generating infrastructure and is a heat supplier. So say they'd own the heat pump and they provide heat into the network, but perhaps the local authority would own the network itself, or another organization and would be the heat network operator. And then yeah, the other model they've looked at is 100% community ownership, where the community owns and operates the network. Sorry, yeah, owns and operates the network and supplies heat into the network. So the supplier has the contractual agreement with the end customers ultimately. And then they've also responded to some specific queries we raised, such as legal considerations with if there's a fault, some with a pipe in the ground, where does the legal responsibility lie? And they've provided advice on how organizations would need to comply with the evolving regulatory landscape. So yeah, heat network zoning, which was in England, which was mentioned earlier. The output from the consultation on that still hasn't been published. So it's still in a pilot phase. But so at the moment it's unclear what the ramifications are for communities who would look to develop at the kind of sites which we've been looking at, which aren't city centre but are urban sites. So yeah, LuxNova have helped provide some advice along those lines. Right, so conclusions about the centralized heat network model and case studies. So there's significant carbon savings to be had by connecting these buildings to the domestic buildings and various anchor loads to an air source heat pump powered heat network. So we've estimated 80 to 90% reduction in carbon emissions. We think communities looking to develop heat networks definitely would need a lot of additional support to be able to deliver a project and to operate a project, but we don't think there's currently a business case for us to set one up because we've been unable to establish a pipeline of viable projects. For us, High Street is the most viable, and there's some local support there. So we're having ongoing discussions about whether we progress, like support the organisations there to progress the scheme independently of a CHDU. And yeah, I guess in our report we recommend that there's further work to be done to understand the cost of connecting to existing homes of specific archetypes. So using local trades and local skills. There's potentially such a broad range of possibilities with how the price for doing bulk network connections could be achieved. So I think that needs looking into. And if someone is, please let us know. I think there's a question to be posed to the Green Heat Network Fund as to whether they want to proactively support networks which are connected, which are retrofitting homes, who would otherwise find it difficult to decarbonize their heating. So yeah, hopefully we can work with CE to feed this back to them. And then yeah, if progress is made on the above points, then we'd be interested in revisiting whether there is a role for a centralized support unit, such as a CHDU. Right, it's going to take a bit of a change of tack. So I guess partway through the project, I guess as we were developing the case studies, we kind of came to the understanding that maybe that there's plenty of challenges for developing a centralized heat network. And at Bishop's Castle, the planning permission has relatively recently been received for developing a 900 kilowatt wind turbine, community-owned wind turbine. And so we wanted to consider a kind of a counterfactual heat and wind scheme, which could be viable. So the kind of alternative scheme, which we've done some modelling for and investigated, is an energy local style scheme, where we associate local wind generation with local demand. and use some of the cost savings which can be achieved in an energy local style scheme to partially fund the installation of heat pumps and air source heat pumps in individual properties. Um, so we're it's still trying to look at go down an avenue of trying to decarbonize people's heating, but instead of digging trenches and putting pipework in the ground, using electricity network and the kind of methodologies and techniques which Energy Local has pioneered in their clubs, could we could the scheme maintain some of that financial benefit to fund the installation of air source heat pumps in some of the scheme members' homes to decarbonize their heating. Um, so the overall layout or concept, I suppose, is there'd be a local community benefit society which would own a wind turbine, um, and they'd be part of a wider club essentially, which is also then comprised of customers. Those customers could be um, either electricity only customers or customers who sign up to get air source heat pumps installed in their home. So the customers would that for customers which join as electricity only customers, there'd be no upfront charge. For customers who join as air source heat pump customers, there'd be a £3,000 buy-in charge, equivalent to the cost of a boiler replacement. So that could come at a time when they're looking at replacing their boilers, and then an annual charge, standing charge to be part of that scheme. And so the for that £3,000, the scheme would partially fund the installation of a heat pump in that person's house, in that customer's house. So the customer would own the heat pumps. There'd be £7,500 from the boiler upgrade scheme, £3,000 from the customer, and then say £4,500 essentially loaned from the scheme, which is then paid off by a standing charge. Um, so yeah, and then in the middle of all of this, as the way which energy local schemes work, there'd be a licensed electricity supplier, which essentially facilitates the matching of electricity generated by the wind turbine with electricity which is consumed by the customers with or without a heat pump. Um, so we've been yeah, the important, very important, essential point to note is that this is not currently possible, but is looking like it may be more likely because there's a modification called P441. It's a modification to the balancing and settlement codes, which essentially provides some regulatory footing for an energy local style scheme. And whereas at the moment, energy local style schemes can only connect generation and customers, which are at the same voltage level. The hope is with the P441 modification, a local scheme would be defined as generators and customers which connect to the same primary substation. So let's use Bishop's Castle as an example. On the right is a map of the area which the primary substation in Bishop's Castle serves. So it's quite a yeah, all of the kind of orange and red dots are places where there's houses, and yeah, Bishop's Castle is the town in the middle. So the primary substation is that electric pump shape thing, and then the wind turbine is roughly the permitted the wind turbine with planning permission is located roughly where that green wind turbine is. So there's a large area which members could come from. So I guess already compared to a centralized model, you're able to achieve your customer base from a much like broader area, which has its benefits. Um, so at Bishop's Castle, the specific model which we've looked at is electricity would be sold from the wind turbine via direct wire to the Spark Leisure Centre. The Spark Leisure Centre's had PSDS funding to install air source heat pumps. So the leisure centre and the wind turbine would share a grid connection, and the leisure centre would consume electricity generated from the wind turbine before it went into the grid. Then the rest of the customers would essentially be receiving electricity from that turbine as it was generated via the distribution network, and as I said before, they can be located anywhere within that primary substation area. If P441 proceeds as hoped and as it is currently written. Um, there's it within the Bishop's Castle case study, which we've modelled, we've included half of the customers, domestic customers, as being air source heat pump customers, and then the remaining half are split are electricity only customers, a quarter of which of that remaining 50% have existing air source heat pump installations to get a bit of a, I guess, a representation of the balance of heating systems that are currently in the town and area. So we'd be decarbonising heating in 50% of the air source heat pump customers, sorry, in 50% of the customers' homes, and supplying discounted electricity to the remainder. The aim would be to match the existing heating costs of those customers which choose to have air source heat pumps installed. So yeah, we've assumed that energy local tariffs for the club in Corwin would be able to be carried through into this scheme. We've also done some sensitivities looking at other schemes, and the conclusions are roughly similar. Assumed an export PPA of 9 pence a kilowatt hour. Because there's a licensed supply which sits in the middle of this to facilitate the matching of electricity. We've assumed that they'd be paid 2 pence a kilowatt hour for every unit of matched electricity. They'd also receive income from the customers when they consume electricity, which isn't when the wind is generating, or electricity which is in excess of the amount of generation coming from the wind turbine. So they have a couple of income streams there. And then with this setup, we estimate that the scheme could include up to 115 customers, 58 of which would have individual air source heat pump installations. And for those air source heat pump customers, would match their existing heating bills, and replace their heat pump after 15 years. The length of the project is 30 years, so you'd have pay the air source heat pump customers pay £3,000 upfront cost, and then we match their heating bills for the next 30 years, include and replace their heat pumps and service their heat pumps. And then for electricity only customers, they just see a reduction in their energy bills. So yeah, for a scheme of this size, you estimate the capital investment would be about 1.7 million, using a second-hand wind turbine, with a 15-year payback. And there's a balance between ensuring the scheme can demonstrate that the returns on investment are good enough to be able to attract external investment, and then trying to expand to include as many customers. So if the scheme is able to attract investment and it's performing well financially in the future, then we estimate it could be expanded up to 230 customers. There's enough available wind generation to be able to supply that many customers with enough electricity to maintain their overall annual energy bills, whilst also being able to repay the loans. So yeah, this case study is reported in one of our appendices on our website. There's quite a lot of detail in it, so please go and have a read. Okay, yeah. So on our website, we've got reports, which is where the reports are. The final report should be on there later on this afternoon. The model, which is the interactive techno-economic model for the centralized heat network, and then the mapping output from the heat network modeling. So I've spoken for quite a long time. Anyway, any questions?
Thanks, Ben. That's brilliant. There was a lot of information to get through, and I'm sure a lot of people will be their heads will be spinning. But
Yeah.
I've
Well, also
recorded
please,
this, and slides will be available, and the information is available. So,
and please get in touch with us via that email address there if you've got questions which we are unable to answer here.
I think John's been looking at the question and answers.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we've had plenty of questions coming through. Some of them have been answered live in the Q&A chat already, but I'll go through them anyway because they are good questions and deserve a little bit of a wider broadcast. So currently in the open questions, the top one is from Josh Newman. Is there a sense yet of what heat load is needed to make a heat network viable, or what sort of residential density is needed? I suppose it's that linear
Yeah, for that,
heat
I suppose.
density.
Yeah, for Forres, which looks like the most viable, but no one's making a lot of money out of it. It's I think we had I can't remember what was it 2.4 megawatt hours per meter per year. Um, so yeah, I think. But what you could do also to try and answer that question, if you've got a location in mind, is if you go to our mapping outputs, then um, uh, I guess that'll give you an indication of where the better areas to consider developing a heat network are. But yeah, it's um, it also depends on the kind of usage and what your overall heating and energy generation technology are.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, I think there's also a lesson for, I know there's been quite a few feasibility studies going into these types of projects or people wanting to replicate, say, Swaff and Prior. And it'd be good to have a quite a clear steer of where we shouldn't, we can kind of eliminate areas early on from spending too much time on this particular solution and find alternatives. But yeah, I really like the way you're heading with Bishop's Castle as well and working around that. There's another question in the chat from George Nyblock, quite interesting. Did you consider looking at projects targeting waste heat energy sources, like energy from waste or breweries, distilleries?
Yeah, we did. It's hard to map, I guess, firstly for us, so hard to identify locations on a national screening basis. And uh, from our perspective, I think the way to look at the model which we've looked at is it's almost wind subsidized heat. So the kind of the dual income stream from the selling electricity, ideally to a local off-taker, but also then exporting to the grid and selling heat into the network is what facilitates the network to be financially viable. Um, in yeah, in general, um, we don't think you can. It's very hard to get heat networks to stand up without that renewable generation being combined. Yeah, I know there are some projects where they're looking at combining data centers with ambient ground loops and heat pumps, which sounds like a promising way to use waste heat. I guess yeah, I don't know what the heat is that comes out of a brewery. I don't know what level it's at because we're looking at for centralized network, we're looking at yeah, 65, 70 degree flow temperature in the pipes.
We did at Bishop's Castle, we did look at the option of a data center brought specifically into to on the basis that we would buy the heat from them, but unfortunately the broadband just wasn't the connectivity was just not good enough for them. I think if you're going to build a system based on waste heat, you've got to have a lot of confidence that that waste heat is going to continue to be
Yeah.
around. There's a lot of fuss about people relying on incinerators, and incinerators. I suspect that the regulations will tighten up on incinerators, and a lot will close down in the next 10 years or so. So if you had a system based on that, you would need to have a backup plan. And yeah, breweries might be a little bit more reliable, but then an awful lot of breweries have shut down as well, haven't they? So
Hmm.
generally, if you're supplying a customer with electricity, then you do need to think about, well, what if that building shuts down? What if that use goes away? But generally, it's easy to find an alternative. Might not be as good initially, but if it happens after 10 years and you've paid off some of your loans, then you can go to plan B. Whereas if you're reliant on waste heat, that's a big reliance, which I think you have to be very careful of. It's not to say you shouldn't consider it, but it's a big risk factor that you would have to consider if looking at a system that was based on waste heat.
Yeah, I guess also that a point on the renewables is that having local renewable generation does help you insulate the network costs to against kind of global market prices or the behavior of a business, a different business, which you're then dependent on. So
Okay, great. Thanks for your answers there. Got a question here from Rachel Simpson. Sounds like Rachel's in the Solent area. I was an estate agent and domestic energy assessor, and homeowners aren't keen on current heat networks in Southampton due to being tied to fixed costs and a fixed supplier, plus non-controllable heat in well-insulated homes due to high flow temps. Have there been any customer surveys of existing systems to support your journey to wider heat network adoption? Is
I
that
think,
kind of from the consumer customer side
Yeah,
have you looked at?
we there's actually a fairly small heat network in Shropshire, which was for a new build housing association site at Ludlow. And initially, it got a lot of bad publicity, and the headlines in the local paper about people being dissatisfied with it. The housing association have found a company that's gone in there and managed to sort the system out. And they said one of the issues was that people have been tinkering with it, and somebody had gone in and tried to alter this bit without thinking about the overall. So they came in and they took a holistic approach. They did have to invest a little bit of money in improving the system. Now it's running. Everyone's very happy, and we visited a couple of houses, and people were saying how their bills were very reasonable. And you've got to have very good controls. You can't put in a system whereby people's houses are going to overheat and they're paying for heat that they don't want. Unfortunately, older systems, maybe the controls weren't so good, but that's an absolute requirement. And I think the technology has improved, and any heat network now has really got to be on top of that and make sure that they are providing a good service and keeping the costs reasonable.
yeah, and it's becoming a regulated industry where with proper consumer protections through Ofgem. I think so. Yeah, people on heat network operators are not going to be able to sell heat at excessive prices.
Okay, I'll cover some of the questions that have already been answered, but they're worth repeating, I think. One from Sydney Charles. Why not study smaller scale networks not needing such long pipes, which incur high embodied carbon costs and high trench costs, very high, particularly in dense urban areas? Is that a kind of embodied carbon factor here?
That's a good question. I can't give you a good factual answer about the embodied carbon, sorry, off the top of my head. I think it's small if when you're saying a small heat network, I guess you ideally you want your heat density to be as high as possible. So you can only do a small heat network if there is enough heat density there. And because we all say it's our opinion that the renewable generation needs to be combined with the to supply a lot of the electricity to the heat pumps. And so we're looking for sites which have high enough density heat demand, a mix of domestic and some useful non-domestic buildings, somewhere to go and put the energy center, so space for the energy center, and then space for nearby renewables. And I guess we've been the screening work which we did, we tried to find the best locations which met those criteria, and it is what it is. Like the locations which we looked at are what has come out of that process. So yes, it would be better to install a heat network which is shorter for the amount of heat demand which it can supply, but yeah, those locate it's not obvious to us which locations are much better for the kind of the overall scope of what of the model and the concept which we were looking at.
Yeah, I think it's a question of trying to get the maximum heat in the shortest amount of pipe whilst supplying a wide range of buildings. I mean, it's the schemes that are getting green heat network funding, it seems to me, are mostly fairly small city centre schemes, small in terms of the number of buildings that they're in the area they're covering, but they are large buildings with large heat demand, so
And
they
often
can
quite strung out as well, seemingly.
yeah, so they can afford to go in and at the sort of 2.5p price. I mean, the alternative is to go for the ambient loop sort of net zero terrace streets approach, which, as we've already said, we think other people are covering, so we didn't want to replicate their work. And as we know that they have issues of their own, but we thought it was better to open up a different channel that we felt people weren't already working on, and then we can see which actually becomes more prevalent as we move forward. And it's not either or necessarily; it's horses for courses, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, there's a couple of questions here from Tim Sherman relating to the best proportion between residential loads and non-residential sites in the heat network, and then what proportion of people you need to sign up to make it viable. Yeah, I think the issue you had with the PSDS scheme taking away anchor loads is it's common with other municipal bigger heat networks as well, and this
Mm,
mismatch in policy between some schemes been able to pay for heat network connections, but domestic schemes not. That's definitely something we can make sure DESNZ and GB Energy
Yeah,
try and align with
yeah,
whatever support they bring forward through the Warm Homes Plan for sure.
I guess that's
Um,
a yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
yeah. I'd better answer this, Ben, because I've already answered it in the in the question answer thing. So just to prevent you giving a different answer. So, yeah, so 25% non-domestic load is good up from there, I would think. And by non-domestic, we're not talking industrial really. That it could be offices, but it's more likely to be schools and leisure centres and community facilities and that sort of thing. As to the proportion of buildings that take part, I think as Ben did mention earlier that he'd halve the heat demand figure to get to get to have a reasonable assumption so that we weren't assuming that everyone is going to join up. Um, but it's the question then is whether you would take your heat network down any particular street. Once you've got your core, you've got your central spine for your heat network. But if you're going to go down a side street, then you're going to have to ask the question, well, how many people down this side street want to connect to the heat network? And then on that basis, you might say, well, we need 80% for us to be worth going down this side street.
mm,
Um, and then, um, so it's not a straightforward answer.
I agree.
okay.
Good.
Time for one or two more questions, I think. There's one here from Russell Hoare. Swimming pool leisure centres keep popping up and not surprising as they're good sources of demand. Have any projects looking at using a swimming pool as a thermal store for the wider network? And I guess there's a related point here about the flexibility income and storage income that might come from like the flexibility side of grid services that come from this type of project. Is that a
Yeah.
factor?
Yeah, I think Geraint answered this one that, yeah, I mean, the temperature that you need a swimming pool at is a fairly narrow band. So unless somehow you could heat it up o higher overnight and then take some heat out first thing in the morning, um, yeah, I doubt if that would be worth doing. But certainly thermal store is a relatively cheap thing to be able to put in. It's a lot cheaper than electrical storage, and all the schemes we've looked at have included, what was it? Is it 150 cubic meters of thermal storage sort of?
Yeah, yeah, at least if not up to 400 or so, I think so.
Yes. So and you can see that, and I think the pictures of existing heat networks that Ben has shown have all got, quite large things that look a bit like grain silos, but they're actually thermal stores.
Mm.
I don't know if I think some of the more modern swimming pools do have like heat recovery units in them combined with the heat pumps which would be installed, but I don't, yeah.
Yeah, I think the heat recovery is normally on the air that you
Ah, so,
need.
yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, you have a ventilation system because you need to be removing the moisture.
Mm, mm.
Um, but
Yeah.
you then do a heat recovery on that. And of course, the same. Somebody mentioned waste heat from breweries, but of course, the best breweries preheat incoming water.
Mm,
I
yeah, of course.
recommend a visit to Hobson's in South Shropshire if anyone wants to see visit a brewery that that has got their energy use sussed. Um, Very good hospitality as well.
Great. There's one last question that's in the chat. I think is a good one to finish with. I just wanted to, yeah, say, yeah, thanks to Ben and Dave, before we wrap up for all the work you've done on this. And yeah, we'll make sure this recording's available on our YouTube channels, and we'll, yeah, be sharing the recordings,
Yeah,
and all the reports will be available online very soon.
yeah,
Um,
and yeah, thanks to John and Joseph for their support.
Excellent. Yeah, so last question here from Nathan Hine. I think it's good. What are the key considerations for local authorities in helping to facilitate more community heat networks?
Oh, I think with what are the key considerations? I think developing an understanding of how much risk the local authority is interested and willing to take on is something which uh, yeah, will need to be discussed at Forest, for example, if this project continues. Um, I know that yeah, Murray County Council are, or in Scotland, the local authorities are kind of ahead of England from like a heat network zoning perspective, and they've already um, had areas and drawn up areas which are focus areas for heat network development. And it seems like, I guess they're waiting, perhaps the local authorities are waiting for zoning work to be done to provide that information. So yeah, I guess local authorities having an idea of where they think heat networks could be developed as a starting point for um, communities to look into focus areas for taking on community-owned development of heat networks
Yeah,
is important. But yeah, whether the local authority wants to act as a heat network operator or perhaps have a stake within the community ownership, that's another important consideration.
yeah. I mean, the Swaff and Prior scheme is actually owned and run by Cambridgeshire County Council. We don't see that to be a replicable model. We don't think many um, councils are going to take that level of risk, particularly in the current economic climate. I mean, particularly in Shropshire, the Shropshire Council is, on the verge of bankruptcy. So there's no way that they're going to take this. So, they if they want to see heat networks in their area, then they have two choices. They can talk to a private developer, or they can encourage a community-led solution. And we see that there are advantages both ways, but we see a huge advantage in a heat network being community-led and community-run. Potentially in partnership with a commercial operator. But we've seen in Bishop's Castle the difference it makes having that community aspect to it, reassures people, that they know it's not some commercial operator who's going to be ripping them off and is going to develop the scheme and sell it 2 years down the line and all the rest of it. So
Mm,
I would certainly urge councils to work with, if there is a keen community energy group in your area, I'd certainly work with them and encourage them. One of the big problems we have with councils is that we're normally talking to the carbon team or somebody who gets it, and they're normally very encouraging and very helpful. But at some point, it's going to end up in the legal department or the procurement team, who don't necessarily get it and haven't got the same understanding and all that. So, if a council is going to work on this sort of scheme, then I think the message has got to be spread throughout the organisation, so that it doesn't just land on somebody's desk who says no, without
great.
really understanding what's in front of them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to finish on there, Dave. More communities taking the lead on these things, more wind, more community heat, and yeah, we'll continue to work with you to make sure we cascade all this learning throughout our members. And as soon as the circumstances change, I'm sure we'll have another crack at it.
Yeah, great. Okay, and we're spot on an hour and a half.
Yep. So please complete the poll if it's popped up on your screen. And yeah, thank you for all your questions. And just quick plug, we've got a community energy campaign launched to raise public awareness about everything we're doing called Up the Energy. There's a link in the chat and um, yeah, more of that coming in the new year. But yeah, please do take a look at that.
Thanks all.
Okay, cheers, bye.